Royal Air Force Waddington sits on a low limestone ridge 5 miles south of Lincoln Cathedral. And on the afternoon of the 10th of July, 1956, the first production, Avro Vulcan, Mark 1, serial XA897, touched its main wheels onto the runway there. The aerodrome had been chosen in 1953 by the Air Ministry's Operational Requirements Branch for a specific reason. The flat, agricultural belt running from the Wash to the Humber estuary offered the longest stretches of unobstructed concrete in the British Isles, and the prevailing westerlies allowed bombers to climb to operational height before crossing the North Sea. Within 18 months of that first arrival, Bomber Command had 3 squadrons of Vulcans operating from Waddington alone, with further dispersals planned for Scampton, Coningsby, and Finningley. The Soviet General Staff's 16th Directorate, responsible for assessing Western strategic aviation, took notice almost immediately. A translated extract from a 1957 assessment, later examined by historians at the Wilson Center's Cold War International History Project, described the Vulcan in cautious terms. A 4-engined heavy aircraft of unconventional plan form, capable of operating above the engagement ceiling of the S-25 Berkut surface-to-air missile system, then ringing Moscow. The Berkut, deployed in 2 concentric belts around the capital, had a kill envelope topping out at roughly 75,000 feet. And Soviet engineers were uncomfortably aware that the Vulcan's rated service ceiling with a full bomb load hovered at 55,000 feet. But that lightened versions could climb considerably higher. What troubled Moscow was not the bomber alone, but the geography it implied. Lincolnshire is precisely 2,460 nautical miles from the Kremlin by Great Circle route, well within the Vulcan's combat radius once the Mark II variant entered service in 1960 with its Bristol Olympus 201 engines. The aircraft could lift from Waddington, route north of Norway, cross the Barents at altitude, and descend on Leningrad or Moscow within 4 hours of throttle up. Royal Air Force planning documents released to the National Archives at Kew under the AIR-8 series confirm that target folders were maintained for 106 Soviet bloc cities, with primary aiming points designated for Gorky, Sverdlovsk, and the Kazan Aircraft Works. The deterrent value rested on credibility, and credibility rested on visibility. The Vulcan was deliberately permitted to be seen. Squadron leader Rowley Falk's barrel roll at the Society of British Aircraft Constructors display at Farnborough on the 4th of September 1955 performed in the second prototype VX770 was reported in Pravda within 72 hours. The message carried by the maneuver was unambiguous. This was not a heavy bomber in the conventional Boeing or Tupolev sense, but something approaching a delta-winged fighter at strategic scale, capable of evasive flight that Soviet interceptor pilots had not previously considered possible from a 4-engined aircraft of 99-foot wingspan. Air Vice Marshal Kenneth Cross, then commanding No. 1 Group at Bawtry Hall, recorded in his personal papers, now held at the Royal Air Force Museum at Hendon, that the Vulcan's psychological weight in Whitehall briefings exceeded its raw numerical strength. By 1962, the V-Force never exceeded 159 aircraft of all 3 types combined: Valiant, Victor, and Vulcan. Yet the assumption in the Cabinet Office was that a Soviet first strike would have to account for each individual airframe, each dispersal field, and each 4-minute readiness state. That asymmetry between modest fleet numbers and disproportionate strategic attention defined the bomber's career. Operational Requirement B.35/46 was issued by the Air Staff on the 17th of January 1947, less than 18 months after the first atomic detonation over Hiroshima. The document, drafted under the authority of Air Marshal Sir Ralph Cochrane and circulated through the Ministry of Supply's aircraft branch at Shell Mech's House on the Strand, called for a long-range bomber capable of carrying a £10,000 special store to a target 1,500 nautical miles from base, cruising at 500 knots, true airspeed at 50,000 feet. The specification was, by the standards of 1947, almost beyond the realm of practical aerodynamics. Piston-engined Lincolns, then in Bomber Command Service, struggled to reach 23,000 feet with a 5,000-pound load. 6 firms tendered against the requirement: Avro, Handley Page, Vickers Armstrong, Short Brothers, English Electric, and Bristol. The Avro submission, designated Type 698, arrived from Chadderton in May 1947 under the signature of Roy Chadwick, the chief designer who had given the Royal Air Force the Lancaster 4 years previously. Chadwick was killed on the 23rd of August 1947 when the prototype Avro Tudor II crashed at Woodford after a control rigging error, and the Type 698 program passed to Stuart Davies with aerodynamic work led by the Polish émigré Wacław Czerwinski. The Delta planform was not Avro's first instinct. Early submissions showed a more conventional swept wing of 45 degrees. It was the wartime German research recovered by the British Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee, particularly the work of Alexander Lippisch on tailless deltas conducted at the Aerodynamische Versuchsanstalt at Göttingen, that pushed Avro toward the configuration that eventually flew. The Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough constructed a series of 1/3 scale research aircraft, designated Avro 707, beginning with VX784, which first flew on the 4th of September 1949. 5 of these miniature deltas were built, each exploring a different facet of low-speed handling, and they provided the data that allowed the full-scale prototype VX770 to take to the air at Woodford on the 30th of August 1952 in the hands of Rowley Falk. The aircraft that emerged was unlike anything previously fielded. Its wing area of 3,554 square feet exceeded that of the Boeing B-52 by a considerable margin, despite the Vulcan being a lighter aeroplane overall. The structure was built around a single mainplane spar running the full span, with the 4 Bristol Olympus engines buried in pairs at the wing root, exhausting through rectangular nozzles cut into the trailing edge. The crew of 5, 2 pilots, 2 navigators, and an air electronics officer occupied a pressurized compartment in the extreme nose, with only the pilots provided with ejection seats. The 3 rear crew, in the event of catastrophic failure, were expected to bail out manually through the entrance door beneath the fuselage, a decision that would cost lives over the bomber's operational career. The Treasury, under Chancellor Rab Butler, expressed considerable disquiet at the unit cost, which by 1956 had reached £750,000 per airframe, equivalent to roughly £23 million in present-day values. Yet the Cabinet Defence Committee, chaired by Anthony Eden, approved a production order of 99 Mark I aircraft on the 14th of September 1954, with the understanding that the Vulcan, alongside the Handley Page Victor and the already flying Vickers Valiant, would constitute the airborne element of an independent British nuclear deterrent. The weapon at the centre of the entire V-Force enterprise carried the codename Blue Danube, and its physical dimensions dictated the geometry of every British bomber bay built between 1948 and 1958. The bomb measured 24 feet, 2 inches in length, 62 inches in maximum diameter, and weighed precisely 10,250 pounds in its initial Mark I configuration. It was the product of high explosive research, the cover designation given to the British atomic weapons program directed by William Penny from the establishment at Fort Halstead in Kent, later relocated to Aldermaston in Berkshire in April 1950. Penny, who had been one of 3 British observers at the Trinity test in the Jornada del Muerto on the 16th of July 1945, designed Blue Danube as a plutonium implosion device closely modelled on the Fat Man weapon dropped over Nagasaki, though with a more refined levitated pit core that improved yield efficiency. The first operational round entered service with No. 138 Squadron at Royal Air Force Wittering on the 7th of November 1953, carried initially by the Vickers Valiant. Yield, according to documents declassified under the 30-year rule and held in the AB-16 series at Kew, was rated nominally at 12 kilotons, though variants designated Mark II carried boosted cores producing closer to 40 kilotons. The dimensions mattered absolutely. The Vulcan's bomb bay, 30 feet long and clear of internal obstruction, had been specified expressly to accommodate Blue Danube with handling clearance for the Type F bomb hoist used at the Central Armament Depot at Royal Air Force Barnham in Suffolk. Barnham, surrounded by a double fence perimeter and a herd of grazing sheep that doubled as an early warning system against intrusion, held the operational stockpile of British atomic weapons from 1954 onwards. The site contained 57 HESCO-style storage hutches, each capable of holding a single fissile core in a temperature-controlled cell, with the high explosive lenses stored separately in adjacent buildings to comply with the safety doctrine inherited from the Manhattan Project. The relationship between bomb and bomber created an awkward operational reality. Blue Danube required a final assembly stage involving the insertion of the plutonium pit into the high explosive sphere, a procedure performed by armourers from No. 1000 Wing of the Royal Air Force Police, who held the only access codes. The procedure took approximately 90 minutes per weapon under ideal conditions, which sat uncomfortably with the 4-minute readiness state demanded by the quick reaction alert posture introduced in 1962. The compromise, recorded in Bomber Command Operations Manual S34/6, was that aircraft on quick reaction alert carried fully assembled weapons with the safing pins inserted, removable by the captain only upon receipt of the authentication signal transmitted from the high-frequency Global Communication System station at Royal Air Force Rugby. By 1958, Blue Danube was already approaching obsolescence. The successor weapon, codenamed Yellow Sun Mark I, entered service in November of that year with a yield of 400 kilotons, and Yellow Sun Mark II, fielded from 1961, employed the Red Snow warhead, an anglicized version of the American W-28 thermonuclear physics package shared under the Mutual Defense Agreement of July 1958. Red Snow yielded 1.1 megatons. The Vulcan's bomb bay, originally designed around the bulk of Blue Danube, accommodated all 3 weapons without structural modification, which proved to be one of Roy Chadwick's quieter triumphs of foresight. The doctrine that governed the Vulcan's first operational decade rested on a single tactical assumption: that a bomber cruising above 56,000 feet at Mach 0.93 lay beyond the practical reach of Soviet air defenses. The assumption was not unfounded. The Mikoyan Gurevich MiG-19, the principal Warsaw Pact day fighter of the late 1950s, possessed a service ceiling of 58,000 feet, but could only sustain that altitude in zoom climb, lacking the energy reserves to maneuver against a co-altitude target. The S-75 Davina surface-to-air missile, known to NATO as the SA-2 guideline, did not enter operational service in numbers around Moscow until 1957, and even then its engagement envelope tapered sharply above 60,000 feet. The Royal Air Force codified its high-altitude penetration profile in Bomber Command Tactical Note 47, issued from headquarters at High Wycombe in March 1957. Vulcans would climb after takeoff in a pre-planned spiral over the home aerodrome until reaching 45,000 feet, then cruise climb on a northeasterly heading, crossing the Norwegian coast near Stavanger at 52,000 feet and entering Soviet airspace over the Kola Peninsula at maximum altitude. The terminal phase involved a steep descent only in the final 10 miles to the target, a maneuver intended to defeat the proximity fuses of any surviving point defense missiles. The dispersal scheme was the second pillar of the doctrine. Air Marshal Sir Harry Broadhurst, Commander-in-Chief of Bomber Command from 1956, recognized that concentrating the V-force on its 8 main operating bases offered an irresistible target to a Soviet preemptive strike. The solution, approved by the Cabinet Defense Committee in October 1958, was the designation of 36 dispersal aerodromes across the United Kingdom, each capable of receiving 4 Vulcans within 90 minutes of a generation order. The list included civil aerodromes such as Manston in Kent, Prestwick in Ayrshire, and Llanbedr in Merionethshire, alongside Royal Air Force stations more conventionally associated with fighter command, such as Leuchars and Lossiemouth. Each dispersal airfield was equipped with a quick reaction alert facility, known to crews simply as the Q-shed, a 3-sided concrete pen at the runway threshold housing 4 armed bombers at constant readiness. The drill was rehearsed daily. On receipt of the code word EDOM, transmitted from Headquarters Bomber Command, crews ran from the alert hut, started all 4 Olympus engines simultaneously using the Plessy Palust ground cart, and were rolling on the runway within 4 minutes. The figure was not arbitrary. It represented the estimated flight time of a Soviet R-12 intermediate-range ballistic missile from launch sites at Kapustin Yar to detonation over central England, a calculation performed by the Joint Intelligence Bureau in Whitehall and circulated under the file reference DEFE 44. The exercises that tested this posture were prosaic in name and ferocious in execution. Exercise MIC, conducted on the 20th of June, 1961, generated 48 Vulcans from runway in 9 minutes 30 seconds, a figure later cited in House of Commons defense debates as evidence that the V-force was credible. Exercise Mickey Finn, run on a no-notice basis in March 1962, dispersed the entire force across the 36 bolt holes within 4 hours of the scramble signal. Crews lived for 48-hour periods in the Q-sheds, sleeping in flying suits, their personal effects sealed in canvas bags. The atmosphere, as recorded in the squadron diaries of No. 83 Squadron at Scampton, was one of a profession that had accepted, with characteristic British understatement, that its working day might end in incineration. At 8:30 hours, Greenwich Mean Time, on the 1st of May, 1960, Francis Gary Powers lifted a Lockheed U-2 from the Central Intelligence Agency's forward operating location at Peshawar in Pakistan, climbing on a northwesterly heading toward a planned overflight of the Tyuratam missile range and the plutonium production facility at Mayak. 4 hours and 20 minutes later, at an altitude of 70,500 feet over Sverdlovsk, his aircraft was struck by a salvo of 3 S-75 Dvina missiles fired from Battery 2 of the 57th Anti-Aircraft Brigade. The first warhead detonated approximately 20 meters aft of the U-2's empennage, shearing the long-span wings from the fuselage. Powers ejected at 68,000 feet and was captured on the ground near the village of Kosolino. The implications for Bomber Command were transmitted from the British Embassy in Moscow to the Air Ministry within 72 hours. The cipher telegram, sent over the Foreign Office wire under reference number 274/60, made the operational point in a single sentence. An aircraft cruising 13,000 feet higher than the Vulcan's planned ingress altitude had been engaged and destroyed by a missile system the Joint Intelligence Bureau had previously assessed as ineffective above 60,000 feet. The high altitude doctrine, 8 years in the making, was demonstrably obsolete. The Air Council convened an emergency session at Adastral House on the 23rd of May, 1960, chaired by Air Chief Marshal Sir Thomas Pike. The minutes, held at Kew under file AIR 19/987, record an immediate decision to commission a tactical evaluation of low-level penetration as an alternative ingress profile. The exercise, designated Bahama, was run by No. 83 Squadron at Scampton over the summer of 1961 and involved Vulcans flying simulated attack profiles at 250 feet above ground level across the ranges at Otterburn and Spadeadam. The findings were sobering. The aircraft designed for thin air at high altitude suffered structural fatigue from turbulence at low level at a rate roughly 5 times that experienced in cruise, and the airframe lifespan was projected to fall from 5,000 flying hours to approximately 2,400. The reconfiguration was nevertheless authorized. From January 1963, Vulcan Mark IIs were progressively modified under a program designated Skybolt/Modification Bulletin 933. The aircraft received terrain-following radar of the General Dynamics AN/APN-171 type, mounted in a thimble fairing on the nose, and the upper surfaces of the wing and fuselage were repainted in a disruptive camouflage scheme of dark sea grey and dark green, replacing the high-altitude white anti-flash finish that had defined the V-Force silhouette since 1958. The undersurfaces retained gloss white for the early years of the transition, then shifted to camouflage entirely from 1973. The new tactical doctrine, formalized in Bomber Command Operations Manual, Amendment 7 of November 1963, called for ingress at 300 feet above terrain at 450 knots, descending to 200 feet over the target. The crews trained for the profile across the Highland Glens of Scotland, the Welsh hills of Mac Loop, and the empty quarters of Northumbria. Soviet air defense planning, which had spent a decade preparing engagement geometries against high-altitude bombers, was forced into a parallel reorientation. New low-altitude radars of the P-15 flat-face type were deployed in greater numbers along the Warsaw Pact's western frontiers, and the SA-3 Goa missile system was fielded specifically to address the threat the Vulcan now represented at 300 feet. The third tactical reorientation of the Vulcan's career began not in response to a Soviet shootdown, but in anticipation of one. As early as 1954, the Operational Requirements Branch had concluded that gravity bombs delivered from directly overhead a defended target represented an increasingly poor risk calculation. The answer, designated Operational Requirement 1132, was a standoff weapon, a powered supersonic missile that could be released from the parent aircraft at considerable distance from the aiming point, leaving the crew to turn for home before entering the terminal engagement zone of point defense systems. The contract for the weapon was awarded to Avro and Company on the 3rd of March 1956 with the codename Blue Steel. The missile that emerged from the Avro works at Woodford was a stainless steel cylinder 35 feet in length, weighing 17,200 pounds at launch, powered by an Armstrong Siddeley Stentor Mark 101 liquid-fueled rocket motor burning high-test peroxide and kerosene. The propellants were unforgiving. High-test peroxide, a concentrated hydrogen peroxide of 85% purity, ignited spontaneously on contact with most organic materials, and the ground crews at Royal Air Force Scampton who handled the substance wore full PVC suits with external air supply. 2 armourers at Scampton suffered serious chemical burns during loading procedures in 1963. Incidents recorded in the Station Operations Record Book under file Air 28/1494. Blue Steel entered operational service with No. 617 Squadron at Scampton in February 1963, carried in a recessed under-fuselage station on the Vulcan Mark II. The missile's range, dependent on launch profile, varied between 120 nautical miles for a high-altitude release at 50,000 feet and approximately 45 nautical miles for the low-level penetration profile that had become standard after 1963. The warhead was the Red Snow thermonuclear physics package, the same 1.1 megaton device fitted to the freefall Yellow Sun Mark II, allowing the Royal Air Force to engage targets such as the Kola Peninsula, naval bases, or the Leningrad Air Defense Ring without overflying the terminal target area. The American alternative, the GAM-87 Skybolt air-launched ballistic missile, was the subject of a particularly bitter Anglo-American episode. The Macmillan government had cancelled the indigenous Blue Streak intermediate-range ballistic missile in April 1960 on cost grounds, and committed publicly to acquiring Skybolt as the long-term replacement for Blue Steel. 2 missiles were to be carried under each Vulcan's wings on hardpoints already stress-tested at the Aeroplane and Armament Experimental Establishment at Boscombe Down. The Kennedy administration cancelled the Skybolt program on the 7th of November 1962, citing 5 consecutive test failures at Eglin Air Force Base. And the resulting diplomatic crisis was resolved only at the Nassau Conference between Macmillan and Kennedy on the 18th to 21st of December that year, with the offer of the submarine-launched Polaris system as substitute. The Vulcan thus entered the second half of the 1960s carrying Blue Steel as its primary standoff armament, with a planned out-of-service date of 1970. In practice, the missile was retained until the 31st of December 1970, by which point the Royal Navy's Resolution-class ballistic missile submarines had assumed the strategic deterrent role under Operation Relentless. The Vulcan's nuclear armament reverted to free-fall thermonuclear bombs of the WE.177 series, weighing approximately 950 pounds, with a yield of 400 kilotons, retained on quick reaction alert until the bomber's eventual withdrawal from the strike role in 1982. What the Soviet Union actually thought of the Vulcan, as opposed to what NATO planners assumed it thought, has emerged only gradually since the opening of certain Russian archives in the early 1990s. The principal source is the collection of Glavnoye Razvedivatelnoye Upravlenie assessments transferred to the Russian State Military Archive at Khoroshevskoye Chaussee in Moscow, fragments of which were published by the historian Pavel Podvig in 1998 under the auspices of the Center for Arms Control at the Moscow Institute of Physics and Technology. The picture that emerges is one of considerable Soviet attention to the V-force throughout the 1960s and 70s. A General Staff Threat Assessment dated the 14th of February 1963 classified the British Strategic Bomber Force as the third priority Western nuclear threat, after the United States Strategic Air Command and the French forces Aériens Stratégiques. The document, partially declassified and reproduced in translation by the Cold War International History Project, noted that the Royal Air Force could generate approximately 140 bomber sorties within 12 hours of a generation order, with 72 of those carrying thermonuclear weapons. The targeting assessment estimated that British nuclear forces alone could deliver between 68 and 84 megatons against Warsaw Pact territory in a first wave, sufficient to destroy the central command apparatus of the Soviet armed forces, even if American forces were entirely neutralized by a preemptive strike. The geographic problem the Vulcan posed was particularly difficult. Soviet long-range surveillance radar of the Tall King type, designation P-14, had been deployed from 1959 onwards along the northern frontier from Murmansk through Severodvinsk to Arkhangelsk. The system operated in the very high frequency band at 150 MHz with a detection range of 600 kilometers against high-altitude targets, but its low-altitude coverage was poor, and the radar horizon against an aircraft at 300 feet did not exceed 40 kilometers. The implication, recognized in Soviet air defense doctrine from 1965 onwards, was that British bombers operating at low level could approach the Kola Peninsula virtually undetected until they were already within standoff launch parameters for Blue Steel. The Soviet response involved both technical and operational measures. The P-35 Saturn radar, deployed from 1963 at the Olenogorsk early warning site north of Murmansk, provided improved low-altitude coverage but consumed considerable power and required continuous maintenance during the Arctic winter. The Air Defense Forces, the Wojska Protiwowozdushnoi Obrony, established a dedicated low-altitude interceptor regiment, the 941st Independent Fighter Aviation Regiment at Kilpeava Aerodrome north of Murmansk, equipped initially with Sukhoi Su-9 Fishpot interceptors, and from 1969 with the Sukhoi Su-15 Flagon. The pilots of this unit, according to the unit history compiled by Colonel Anatoly Alexandrovich Sergeyev in 1994, conducted weekly intercept exercises specifically against simulated low-level penetrators emulating Vulcan flight profiles. British signals intelligence, gathered by the government communications headquarters from listening stations at Scarborough on the Yorkshire coast and at Bude in Cornwall, monitored Soviet air defense chatter in the Murmansk military district continuously. A particularly revealing intercept of the 17th of October, 1968, recorded a Soviet sector controller describing inbound British training flights as priority targets. The intercept, processed at Government Communications Headquarters Cheltenham and circulated under the Joint Intelligence Committee weekly summary of the 24th of October, was taken as confirmation that the Vulcan was receiving the operational attention its designers had hoped for. By the late 1970s, the Vulcan was a 16-year-old design, fulfilling a role for which newer aircraft were already entering service across NATO. The Royal Air Force's strategic nuclear deterrent had passed to the Royal Navy on the 15th of June, 1969, when the submarine HMS Resolution sailed from Faslane on the first operational patrol of the Polaris fleet. The Vulcan retained a tactical nuclear role under Supreme Allied Commander Europe, armed with the WE.177 freefall weapon, but the airframe was approaching the limits of its fatigue life, and the planned out-of-service date was set at the 30th of June, 1982. That date proved premature for reasons no air staff planner had contemplated. On the 2nd of April, 1982, Argentine forces under General Mario Benjamin Menendez landed at Mullet Creek on East Falkland and occupied Government House at Port Stanley. The British response, formulated at a meeting of the War Cabinet at No. 10 Downing Street on the 3rd of April under Margaret Thatcher's chairmanship, included the dispatch of a naval task force under Rear Admiral Sandy Woodward and the consideration of options for striking the only hard-surfaced runway on the islands, the 4,100-foot strip at Port Stanley Aerodrome. The runway sat at 51 degrees 41 minutes south, 57 degrees 46 minutes west, 3,375 nautical miles from the nearest available British base at Wideawake Aerodrome on Ascension Island. The mission, designated Operation Black Buck, fell to No. 44 Squadron and No. 101 Squadron at Royal Air Force Waddington, the same aerodrome where XA-897 had landed 26 years earlier. The tactical problem was severe. A Vulcan carrying 21 1,000-pound freefall bombs in the bomb bay had a still air range of approximately 2,600 nautical miles, and the round trip to Stanley required 7,800. The solution was a refueling plan involving 11 Handley Page Victor K Mark II tankers supporting a single bomber, with cascading transfers of fuel between tankers across the South Atlantic. Black Buck 1 was launched at 23:20 hours on the 30th of April, 1982, with the primary aircraft XM-598 suffering a cabin pressurization failure shortly after takeoff and aborting back to Wideawake. The reserve aircraft, XM-607, captained by Flight Lieutenant Martin Withers, completed the sortie. Approaching Stanley at 300 feet from the northeast at 0700 Greenwich Mean Time on the 1st of May, Withers climbed to 10,000 feet for the final bomb run, releasing the stick of 21 bombs across the runway at 07, 46 and 4 seconds. One bomb cratered the runway centerline, denying the strip to fast jets for the remainder of the conflict. The aircraft landed back at Wideawake after 15 hours and 45 minutes airborne, having flown what was at that point the longest bombing mission in the history of aerial warfare. 5 further Black Buck sorties followed between the 4th of May and the 12th of June, 2 of them carrying AGM-45 Shrike anti-radiation missiles against Argentine surveillance radar. The Vulcan was withdrawn from Royal Air Force service on the 31st of December, 1982, 6 months after the original out-of-service date and 6 weeks after the cessation of Falklands hostilities. The aircraft that had been built to deliver Blue Danube against Gorky and Sverdlovsk had instead made its operational combat debut against a runway in the South Atlantic. The Soviet General Staff, watching the operation from satellite imagery and signals intercepts, registered the relevant lesson. A force structure designed for one war had been adapted in 7 days of staff work and 1 night of flying to fight a different one entirely. That adaptability, more than any single technical specification, was what had earned the Vulcan its place in the 16th Directorate's threat catalogue from 1956 until the day it ceased flying.